So we are in the middle of the series called Names. Actually, we're wrapping it up. Today's the last week of the series. And this whole series, what we've been trying to do is to get people to really focus on names. We're trying to take our faith, we're trying to take our commission, we're trying to take our calling and take it from the general and the hypothetical and really make it concrete in each and every person's life. And I believe that starts with knowing people's names. I mean, we talked about the first week, the power of prayer. I mean, as a follower of Christ, and for those of you who've been around church for a while, you know that we're supposed to pray. I bet a lot of you, maybe you're here today because you got a Coke and you're visiting for the first time, and you're still probably aware that Christians pray, like you're aware that's a thing that happens. But here's the question we asked the first week of the series is, what would it look like for you to not just pray generally, but to specifically pray for names, right? Like I think about like my family, instead of praying for teachers and Lord bless teachers, which is a fine prayer, but what if I prayed for Miss Brock, who's my daughter's kindergarten teacher this year? And what if I prayed that God would just protect her and bless her and use her as she shapes the lives of those children in that room with my daughter and really allow that to be a specific prayer? And I think if we each did that in all areas of our lives, and praying for our leaders, and praying for our teachers, and praying for our family members, rather than throwing out blanket prayers, if we focused it to a name, how much more powerful could those prayers be? Last week, if you were here, we talked about this idea of reaching out to a name. What would it look like to reach out to a name? And not just, to reach out to people, but to actually reach out to a person. And that ultimately is what we're trying to accomplish with this series. Here's the deal. At 242, we love to have fun. We're the first in line for fun, okay? But we also realize as a church, as people of God, that we have a commission, we have a mission, we have something that we're supposed to do. And what I know to be true is that Jesus did not say, go out into the world and make a crowd. That's nowhere in Scripture. Go and gather a crowd. That's not what he says. He says, go out into the world and make disciples. Change individual people's lives. And so as we grow as a church and as we get bigger and as there's numbers in these rooms, week in, week out, service after service, the numbers are great. But are we learning people's names? Are we reaching people's names? And that's really what this season is for us. And that's really the challenge I'm going to offer you guys today. I mean, Eric was up here earlier and he talked about, the billboards and the postcards and the yard signs. The reason we're doing those things is not to change a life. I have yet to baptize someone, and I'm like, oh, well, how did you meet Jesus? I saw a billboard and I just needed Jesus, right? Maybe it's happened to you. It's not happened to me yet. Usually it's, what led you to this point in your life? And they're like, somebody invited me to church. Somebody was a friend, my family member was something. And these billboards and postcards and yard signs, all this is just us trying to just soften the soil for you. We're trying to just take a garden weasel to Livingston County and just break it up a little bit so that when you talk to somebody about, hey, would you like to come to church with me this weekend? What church do you go to? I go to 242. I've heard of that. I've seen a sign. But that's our heart. Our marketing is not going to change a person's life. But what it can do is it can make your job a little bit easier. Because that's what I believe that we're called to do as a church. We're called to equip the saints to do the work God has for them to do. And we believe each and every one of us in this room have a role to play in reaching people for Jesus. Each and every one of us. And I think to be effective and reach that role, you're going to have to know people's names. A friend of mine, we were talking about this topic of names and particularly how it pertains to parenting, but here's what's interesting to me. If you want to know the level of relationship that you have with someone, count the layers of names that you know in their lives. Think about that. If you want to know the level of relationship you have with someone, count the level of names you know in their life. Now, some of us, we have the standard go-to excuse, I'm bad at names, right? That's just not me, I'm bad at names, right? I get it, but that's not an excuse that we can live by. We need to get better at names. Because names matter to the people who they belong to, and those people matter to God. And I've been there too. I messed up some names in my life, okay? But we just have to get over that. I mean, I've been to Home Depot and somebody walks up to me, hey, Brad, what's up? I go to 242. And I'm like, hey, you? It was easier when I was a youth pastor because I could be like, hey, buddy, but like, you can't buddy a 50-year-old man, you know? Like, so I'm like, you know, and I flubbed big. Like I've had people come in just crying, Brad, just, life's hard. Would you pray with me? I'm like, absolutely, I'll pray with you. Like, hoping for a miracle, like God will put the name in my head before I start praying, And they're like, you don't know my name, do you? I'm like, I don't. But at some point, we just have to get over the awkwardness and just learn the names. Like, maybe you've lived in your home for 15 years, and you have no idea who lives next door to you. Maybe it's time just to walk over and knock on the door and be like, I'm an idiot, but I want to love you. What's your name? Like, either that or you could just rush home and sneak in their mailbox. But don't open it because that's a federal offense. You have to learn people's names. And I would even say, what would it look like for you to learn circles of names and levels of names? Because the more names you know surrounding a person's life, the more intimate you are in the life of that person. I have friends who I know their names. Maybe I know their wives' names. Maybe you have coworkers, like at the office, and you know their name, but maybe you don't know their wife's name. Then that kind of like shows you the level of relationship that you have with them. But I think about my best friend, and probably my best friend in this world, Trevor. I know Trevor. I know his wife's name's Allison. I know his kids' names, Will and Ben. I know Trevor's sister's name, Tracy. I know his parents' name, Roger and Janet. I know Allison's sister's name, Gina, and her husband's name's Lyon. They have kids, Katie and Colin. And I didn't practice this. I didn't quiz this. I know Trevor. He matters to me. He's my best friend in this world. And I know him, and I know all the names that surround him and that matter to him. How many names of people do you know? Parents, do you know the names of your kids' friends? Do you know the names of who matters to your kids? Sometimes if you feel distant, maybe it's because you are. And maybe we need to start learning about people's lives and leaning into this. And a good way to do that is to learn names. That's what this whole series is about. It's about reaching people for God, but that only starts when you can invite people to relationship with Jesus, but that only starts if people believe that you care about them. And I believe a huge stepping stone in letting people know that you care about them is learning their name. Because here's the interesting thing. As you get to know people and as you get to know where they are in life, then you know kind of how to approach them. Because different people need different things. It's interesting as you look in Scripture and you look in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, Jesus, Paul, the disciples, the way that they interact with people are different depending on the person. The way that they invite somebody to Jesus, the way that they correct somebody in the way that they live, the way they want to encourage someone to live a life, of greater, value, or like the way that they interact with people, it changes from person to person. The way Jesus interacts with the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus is completely different, even though both of them have the same issue of greed and money. And so rather than just like a one-size-fits-all approach to introducing people to Jesus and inviting people to church, what would it look like if we learn people's names, we learn their stories, and we just spoke into that with the love of Christ and with truth? That's what I want to encourage us to do today, and that's what I want to talk about. And I really want to encourage us by looking at two different groups of people in the Bible. Because really, when you kind of lump it up, these are the two kind of groups that you see over and over again, and that these are two groups that Jesus has the most diverse style of communicating with. The first group are these group of people called the Pharisees. Now, if you've been around church for a while, that's a very familiar term to you. Maybe some of you are new this week, you're here hanging out. A Pharisee is like the first century religious elite. These are the people who were raised in church their whole life. These are the people who played with flannel graph when they were like 2. These are the people, they know everything there is to know about the Bible in the King James, and they know like all that stuff. Like this is like the people who just like in their heart is to honor God. But somewhere along the way, their heart has gotten hardened, and somewhere along the way, they kind of forgot what they're really supposed to be doing. And so Jesus is very interesting. You would think these people who are following rules, you would think these people who are living pretty much everything perfectly to the dot as it's written on paper would be Jesus' best friend. But they're not. In fact, it's to these people that Jesus seems to have the less amount of patience. He seems to have less reserve in how he speaks to them. And it's to these people that he really calls them out. He uses some of his most stern language towards these people. I mean, I know a lot of times we think of Jesus as like the first century Mr. Rogers. Like, won't you be my disciple? But when you read how Jesus interacts with these Pharisees, that's not how he talks. In fact, Matthew 23, you see this language. He's preaching in the temple. He's on their home turf. He's preaching to, all these sinful people who don't know God who are around there. The Pharisees are right there in the temple. Matthew 23, Jesus starts off, he says, look, you must be careful to do everything they tell you. So you must be careful to do everything, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. He's like, what these Pharisees saying, it's like technically it's true. Like technically what they're saying is right. But these people don't practice what they preach. They don't live it out. And then he gives all these woe statements. Woe to you. He turns to the Pharisees. Woe to you because you do this. And woe to you because you do that. And you could read this week, Matthew 23. Read about what Jesus warns these Pharisees to do. I want to focus on one of them. He goes down in verse 24. He's talking to the Pharisees. He says, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Right? And we're like, what does that mean? That's not going to taste good. Basically what he's saying is this. You get so caught up worrying about the little things. You're so caught up just trying to nitpick all these little preferences, all these little things, and yet you're just swallowing all this stuff that really concerns me. What does that look like in our culture? And I've seen it, believe me, I've seen it too many times. I've had conversations, and I'm not calling anyone out. I've just had conversations time and time again where people are like, I love coming to 242. I just don't like that style of music. Do you like 370 some people being baptized every year? I mean, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Lives are being changed, and if something doesn't meet your preference, does that mean that what we're doing is wrong? How about let's judge by our fruits. But what happens is, when we're around church for a while, we forget who church is for, we forget what church is trying to do, and we start to get preferences, and everybody does it. It's very natural for everybody to do it. That's why I tell everybody, if you've been a Christian for a year, if you've been a follower of God for a year, read Matthew 23 and see if any of this has crept into your life. Because we are sinful people, and it's easy for this to creep into each and every one of our lives to some degree or another. And then we need to look at our own heart. Before we look at anything else, look at our own heart and say, am I straining out gnats here, or am I really focusing on what matters to God? I mean, how would Jesus respond to us today if we were only focused on these gnats and we're missing the big picture? I mean, I can see Jesus preaching us today, like, woe to you who are all caught up, on deciding what you're going to wear to church, but you really don't care about the poor in our community and the homeless. Or if Jesus is like, woe to you who are really hot and bothered because Walmart's selling holiday trees instead of Christmas trees, but you don't care about the neglected in our community. Woe to you who are Facebook posting about the sanctity of marriage when you yourself aren't even being faithful to your spouse. You see, it's easy for us to be around church for a while and to follow a couple rules and to act like we have it all together, and then to turn around and look down on other people. But Jesus said, I have no time for that. I have no patience for that. The purpose of the rules is not even for you to feel superior to another person. The purpose of the rules is to let you know that you need me and that we all sin. We all fall short. That's why verse 27, Jesus says this, says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. I think there's a lot of churches that if Jesus was sitting in front of them today, he would say that message. I think there's a lot of us in this room. Woe to you. You talk the talk, and you look the part, but you don't really care about what God cares about. Your heart doesn't break for the things that breaks God's heart. And there's a problem if you're okay with that. You're being hypocritical. And I know maybe that's a word that you've heard thrown out there at church, and churches are hypocrites and Christians are hypocrites because they're sinful. No. Christians are not hypocrites because we're sinful. We're only hypocrites if we act like we don't have sin. Because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And churches are filled with sinful people. We are all sinners in need of a Savior. Nobody is perfect, not even one. I am not perfect. I sin daily. Nobody on this stage is perfect. Nobody on this staff is perfect. Nobody in this room, Jesus, are you here? Okay. Nobody in this room, except for the Spirit of God, is perfect. And we need to own that. And when people come in, they need to hear that and be aware of that they're welcome here. And their junk is welcome here, and their mess is welcome here, and their hurt is welcomed here, and their pain is welcomed here. Because this is where we all come to kneel by the foot of the cross, to pray to God, to ask him to be with us. That is the purpose of this, to not take ourselves so seriously. Jesus kind of wraps up earlier in the section, woe to you. He says, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. If you act like you have it together, you're going to be made to look like a fool at some point, because you don't have it together. He says, but those who humble themselves will be exalted. Just own who you are. And as we're inviting people to church, as we're inviting people to this community, we need to invite them to a community that's authentic and real. People don't need perfection. They need hope, and they need truth. So when Jesus is looking at these Pharisees, he's just fed up with the rule following. All they care about is the rules. At one point, they loved me. At one point, they cared about their relationship with me. But now it's just rules, 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 rules. And now, the way that they interact with people is solely based around rules. Look how Paul writes this. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians. And I love this verse in 1 Corinthians because when I first read this, it was an eye-opener for me as a Christian. This was so opposite of what I've seen up this point in my life. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, Paul says, I have written to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, which makes sense, right? These people are sexually immoral, don't associate with them. Great, because that sounds icky, so just don't mess with them. But then look what he says when he goes on. Now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral, greedy, an adulterer, or slanderer, drunkard, or swindler. With such a man, do not even eat. See, when he's talking about don't associate with the sexually immoral, he's not talking about the sexually immoral who don't know God, or the sexually immoral who aren't a part of your community, sexually immoral you work with, or in your family, or who are far from God. He says, in fact, if you're trying to stay away from sinful people, or people who struggle with sin, or people who live lives of sin, you'll have to leave this earth, because everybody just naturally kind of goes headlong into sin until they learn something different. But what Paul's concerned about is the people in the church. He goes on in verse 12 and 13, he says, what business of it am I to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? Think about that. I think we oftentimes give our harshest criticisms and our harshest words to people outside the church and our harshest judgment to people outside the church. You guys are sinful. You didn't go to church on Sunday. You're watching the Lions lose again. How dare you? And then for the people inside the church, we're like, oh, it's okay if you're not really living this out. And Jesus and Paul are like, it's the exact opposite. If this is your church home, if you've committed your life to Christ, if you say, I want to live for Jesus, and you're not, then you should have people in your life who challenge you, who hold you accountable, who speak truth into your life, who say, no, it's not okay to continue to do that when you say you want to live for Christ, because Christ says that we shouldn't do that. And we should have that kind of honest conversations with people inside the church. But people outside the church, what is it? Of course, here's the thing. People who don't know Jesus, they tend to act like people who don't know Jesus. And they're playing by a different set of rules in life, and we can't put our standard on them because they have not accepted that. I mean, you see a referee blowing his whistle in a football game and calling double dribble, right? 2 different sports, 2 different sets of rules. And what's going on is like Jesus saying, for the people outside the church, they don't need more rules. They need me. The people inside, they need to know these steps and how to really, but people outside, why are you leading with rules? I think about, if we are the bride of Christ, right? I think about, we're supposed to be, married to Christ, and I think about my own wife. What if when I met my wife, and I was like, we maybe went on a date, and I'm like, I think I'm ready to marry you. What if she pulled out a folder of just like, okay, well, here's all the things you're going to have to change about yourself before you can marry me? Right? Could you imagine that? Could you imagine if that's how our relationship started? Here's all the rules that I'm going to need you to follow, okay? I'm going to need you to brush your teeth more than once a day. You're going to have to stop biting your nails. I'm going to need you to give me all your money, and I'll give you back an allowance. I'm going to need you to be aware that when you speak, you have tones in your voice. Who knew that? And that the tones are more important than what you actually say. So you now have to learn this whole new tone language, I'm going to need you to, What if she listed all these things that over 12 years of marriage, I've gladly changed? Over 12 years of marriage, I've gladly changed all these things. But you know what? It wasn't because she gave me this list and I read through it and I initialed each page. And it's because I met her. I fell in love with her. And I just wanted to be around her. And I knew that she felt more loved when I brushed my teeth more often. So I gladly did that. And even though she knows I feel more love if she squeezed the toothpaste at the end, she still hasn't. It's okay, though. We have separate tubes. Okay, Nobody reads the terms of agreement. Nobody cares about rules. It's a horrible way to make a relationship happen. The rules are for the people in the church who are trying to live by a standard, and we should hold each other accountable about that. But the people outside the church, we need to introduce them to Jesus. We need to be matchmakers. We need to be setting up dates. And when they meet Jesus, when they fall in love with him, when they experience who he is, his love, his truth, when they experience life to the full, they're going to want to change. That's what the Holy Spirit does. That's what God does. But that's not our job. And so as we're thinking about this idea of introducing people to Jesus, what does it look like for you to do that? What we've done over the last 3 weeks is just try to make the soil less firm. We try to soften the soil. We try to break it up so that for the next 2 weeks, next 3 weeks, you have an opportunity to learn someone's name, to invite them to a relationship with Jesus. Don't be pharisaical about it. But be genuine. Because when people experience the love of Jesus, their life is changed. I think about John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. We preached on this story a while back, and maybe some of you have heard this story before, but here's Jesus again. He's in a town, he's preaching, and this woman is caught in the act of adultery. How embarrassing. She's breaking a rule. And so these Pharisees, they grab her out of their home. They drag her into public. We don't know if she's covered or not, to what degree or not. They throw her down in front of Jesus. And they ask Jesus. He said, John chapter 8 says, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. They go on what do you want us to do with her? The rule is she should be killed. The rule is she should be killed. The Bible tells us that Jesus bends down, starts writing on the ground. It doesn't tell us what he wrote. We don't know. Could be the sins of the Pharisees. He could have been just averting his eyes from the woman. Maybe he wrote her name and that he knew her. Whatever it was, the people around dropped their rocks. They started to walk away. And this woman experiences what God offers all of us: grace, love, forgiveness. Jesus asks the woman, says, "Woman, where are your accusers? Is there no one left to condemn you?" She answers, "No, they've gone." And so, out of love, Jesus encourages her, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. Stop living that way." But notice how it works. Jesus doesn't start with the rule. He starts with the relationship. And when she experiences that grace and that Jesus accepts her right there where she is in her mess, then Jesus says, there's a better way to live. A lot of you in this room, you've experienced that grace already. Maybe you've forgotten what life was like before Jesus. Maybe you forgot what it was like to go to church for the very first time, to be scared. Maybe you've forgotten what it was like that people would know that your family wasn't perfect. Maybe you forgot what it was like when you first started going. Maybe you forgot what it was like when you first experienced grace, when you worshiped with so much passion, where you just could not believe that God wanted to know you and love you, and you forgot what it was like when you first fell in love with Jesus.